There are so many variables when it comes to the short game. We can and we should make it a lot simpler. So I'm going to give you 3 big keys, differentiators between pitching and chipping. 3 keys that you can apply to every single shot you face, whether it's a chip shot or a pitch shot, and you will be more consistent, less confused, and hopefully play much better golf. The main difference when it comes to the type of shot we want to hit before we get into the technique aspect is really just understanding that the ball is going to roll more than it's going to carry. So the shots we want to hit are going to be intended to roll a lot more than fly it a lot more. So that should, for the most part, change what club you're hitting. Now, a lot of you grab a 60, a 56 or something. I would suggest that you do not use any more loft than a gap wedge, maybe like a 50, something like that, or a pitching wedge, and you can go up to a 7-iron. I've got an 8-iron here. 9 or 8-iron is one of my sort of go-to when it comes to a very basic chip shot. And by doing this, we're eliminating a lot of possible faults because we don't have to rely on getting a perfect contact. And the reason why a lot of people struggle around short shots when it comes to chipping is using too much loft, trying to be too cheeky, a bit too much finesse or whatever it might be. We have to get ourselves a foundation technique that we can rely on, that we can repeat. So here are the 3 steps we want for every single chip shot. With my 8-iron, the first thing I'm going to do is ensure that I stand a little bit taller to the ball, and I'm going to stand a little bit closer. Just by doing that is actually going to create an action that is going to minimize my wrist movement. Okay, we want to try and eliminate the wrist movement. We also want to minimize the amount of friction against the grass here so the club can glide through. When we raise the heel up a little bit like this, I'm exaggerating obviously, less of the club is interacting with the turf. So it's going to be more reliable. And that happens just by standing a little bit closer to it. And from here, we can still use our regular golf grip. I'm not necessarily saying use a putting grip. You can if you want, if that feels comfortable. The second step we're going to do is move the ball a little bit further back in our stance here. By doing that, it's going to ensure that we get the right delivery and ball first contact. We don't want to be hitting it down. We don't want to be trying to lift it up. We're moving it back in the stance. So we can literally just drop the club, at the back of the ball with minimal movement. And by doing that, it's going to help us with the third key, which is to have more shaft lean. I talk a lot about getting the setup right, so we need less manipulation. Just to show you, if I was to chip more like this, even with my 8-iron where the ball's further forward, my hands are further back, I have to, really to get the right kind of strike, I have to manipulate my wrist to get those hands forward here. Just doing that alone is going to screw up so many times, especially under pressure. So with that shaft lean, imagining that we have more or less a straight line from the left lead arm, from the shoulder here, all the way down to the club head, and I'm almost pivoting more from my left shoulder, right? This will happen by doing the steps. So we stand closer, we move the ball further back, and I'm going to maintain now through my entire action, I'm going to maintain that feeling where the hands are staying ahead of the club head, right? So by doing this, I can have such a small, minimal action that I can just nudge the ball forward and it's going to give me the nice roll every time. It's going to give me a consistent strike. By trying to do too much, it's how we screw up. Now, I'm off a fairway here. This does apply to off rough as well. A lot of times, if you're on a difficult course, you're going to be in thicker rough. Obviously, if it's buried down, that's going to change the club you use. But I've got an 8-iron here, and I wager most of you out of this particular lie would still pick up your sand wedge and try and sort of flop it up there. Nothing wrong with that, but I don't need to because we've got plenty of green to work with. So I'm going to apply the same method. I'm going to stand closer. I'm going to move the ball further back so it's just sort of inside my heel, and I'm going to do a nice rocking action with minimal hands, keeping the shaft lean forward. I'm just going to brush it off the top of the grass. That is it. Every single time, those shots are going to go closer, more frequently. You have a reliable, trustworthy short game, especially when it comes to chipping. Now, let's move a little bit further away onto the pitching. A lot of times, people totally forget about the importance of tempo and how it's the glue that keeps not just the full swing together, but actually the short game as well. People totally forget it. Putts, chips, pitches, bunker shots, it's the same. Tempo is very important because it's your consistency. Without it, or if it's variable all the time, you're going to struggle, because too slow a tempo is going to change your technique because you'll try and do a bit too much with the hands. Too quick of a tempo, you're not going to be able to have the nice controlled strike, especially when you're a bit anxious or whatever. You need to find your ideal tempo when it comes to your even little chip shots here. However, it's not about being slow, it's just understanding what works best. And you need to think of it more like a pendulum, okay? The shorter the swing, the faster the tempo is going to be. When we get longer, it's going to go a little bit slower. So too many times with students or friends I'm playing with, they're so tentative when it comes to around the greens. They're either taking it back too slowly and then snatching, or it's just way too quick. So you need to find a nice rhythm and a flow, but understand that a shorter chip shot action is going to require a slightly quicker cadence. So you're going to find a nice little cadence and a rhythm that's going to give you that consistency. So be mindful of what your tempo is. Here we are with pitching. Now, I'm not going to go too far back. I've only got like 40, 50 yards kind of range that we're talking here, but it's a very common one that we face when we're playing. Now, again, there's just going to be 3 main keys that I need you to remember, and we're going to go through them one by one, and you're going to apply them one by one, and I promise you, you're going to be striking your pitch shots with more reliability. Step number 1, chipping. We talked about standing a little bit closer and getting the handle a bit higher. We don't need to do that with here. We want a slightly lower release. I'm not going to bore you why, but it's just going to help your trajectory control and low point control. So we're going to stand a little bit more normal. It's not going to be this, like, let's imagine I was going to hit a full shot with my sand wedge here. I'm not going to be here, but I am going to be a little bit closer, just not as close as chipping. So again, I want you to experiment with all these things, but we're going to stand relatively far away. So the handle here is sort of matching my arm length, is matching pretty much a straight line here. We want as minimal variables as possible, but I don't want to be restricted. Just by doing that alone, it's going to help me get a little more rotation on the backswing. We still want to make a nice little rotation on the backswing and drop the club behind the ball without having to force our bodies too much. With that in mind, compared to the ball position when we had chipping, we're actually looking to have it a little bit more forward. With the chipping, we were much nearer the back foot. Here, for pitching, we want to be about where the lead chest is, or a little bit more forward here. This is something that you have to experiment yourself. It will change a little bit on the way you sort of release the club and a few other factors, but I'm not going to tell you that it has to be here or it has to be here. You need to experiment with this. And the same with all these, tips and lessons that are put out. You've got to test them for yourself, because nothing is very, usually black and white. There's usually some kind of variables and customization needed. But the only way you're going to figure it out is to test it. Test that ball position out, but we generally want it a little bit further forward, because we don't necessarily want to be trying to dig down in it. We don't want to be lifting it up, but we want to have a nice sweeping action where our angle of attack is nice and shallow. It gets complicated because we want a bit more angle of attack, but don't worry about that for now. We talked a bit about making sure that the hands stay ahead of chipping. We want that relatively to be applicable to pitch shots. However, when we create our setup, I want you to almost maintain a sensation and a feel. That is, at setup, the club is a bit more vertical. We're a little bit more in line rather than being hands ahead. It's almost going to feel like everything's just dead straight up and down. And the reason why this matters is because as we swing through at impact, I want us to try and match that setup position. So we're going to have a little bit more weight forward this way, as we talked about, but I'm going to allow those hands to just sit fairly naturally, and this shaft is going to be quite vertical. And my objective as I'm swinging down is to allow that club to release. I'm not going to jam the hands forward this way, which a lot of you do. I'm just going to allow it to release at the bottom. So my strike zone, I'm trying to strike it with the shaft more or less vertical. It's going to be a bit ahead, but I don't want you to think about that. And then from there, with that release, that setup and that release, trying to get it back to vertical, I'm going to allow myself to rotate around. I don't want you to release the club so the club is vertical at the bottom and then flip through. That's not what we'd want. It's about releasing to here and then turning through, staying passive with the hands and arms. So it's almost going to feel like a throw and a rotate. It's going to feel like a throw and a rotate. Whereas in the chipping, it was more or less just all my upper body. With here, it's the arms, and then we're getting the core through. Doing that alone is going to give you a very different strike and a good distance control, because we're not relying on just using the hands for that distance control. We can create a swing length that matches the distance we want, and that's how you calibrate yourself to be nice and smooth to get the strikes that you want. We talked a bit about tempo before. With pitch shots, you're going to be much better served to have a slower cadence than we did the chip shot. And just being aware of that is going to help you have a little bit more consistency, because we get too fast or we get too long and then jab it in. We want to be smooth. It's like a smooth little perfect swing. And you're going to practice staying nice and balanced, and see how that club is just moving around me with flow, with freedom. I've done the hard work, which is getting the setup right. And now all I'm going to do is think about tempo to make sure I'm not hinging the wrist too much, but I'm just turning behind and swinging through. These little tricks alone are going to make all the difference when it comes to chipping and pitching. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next time.